This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at NumberFire.com, and this is episode 279 of the Late Round Podcast, one of the many shows that are part of the FanDuel Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. Week 1 is always a tough one for analyzing matchups, but I don't think things were horrible last week on the show. I whiffed on T.Y. Hilton, Jimmy Garoppolo looked really bad, and I should have known better than to think New England's backfield touches would be predictable in Week 1. But things were good too. I talked up Matthew Stafford, I talked down Aaron Rodgers and Ben Roethlisberger, and I had Danny Amendola as a deep sleeper. With more information, these matchups will become a little bit easier to dissect, and hopefully that's the case as early as right now. Before looking at the players this week who I'm higher and lower on versus consensus, I wanted to let you guys know that FanDuel is giving you another chance at $1 million this Sunday. This week's Sunday Million is $9 to enter, and the top prize is $1 million. There are $3 million in total prizes on the line. So head to FanDuel.com right now for a chance at some life-changing money. Eligibility restrictions do apply. Let's kick things off at quarterback this week, and specifically a streaming quarterback option, and that's Derek Carr. Carr gets Kansas City this week, a team that's coming off a game where they allowed 347 passing yards to the combination of Nick Foles and Gardner Minshew. 90% of football fans had no idea there was a player with the name Gardner Minshew in the league before last week. The Chiefs faced the most pass attempts in football last year, so you have sort of a baseline for Carr. But Carr himself has thrown 3 touchdown passes in each of his last 2 home games against Kansas City. He also looked pretty comfortable throwing the rock around on Monday night. So Carr, to me, is pretty undervalued this week, and he should be a very firm QB2 and potentially a higher-end one. As I said on the 15 Transaction Show this week, I also like Josh Allen as a streamer here in Week 2. Allen's now hit 15 or more rushing yards in every start in the NFL, and he's averaged well over 50 rushing yards per game as a starter. That's essentially an extra touchdown pass cushion each week for fantasy purposes. And he gets the Giants this week. The G-Men looked awful defensively against Dak Prescott and the Cowboys in Week 1, and what I liked to see was that they were tied for 3rd worst in the league in giving up 15-plus air yard plays. And what does Josh Allen like to do? He likes to throw the ball deep. So I like Josh Allen this week, and while I won't talk about him on today's show, I think John Brown could be in store for another strong game as well. The last quarterback start for me in Week 2 is someone who's a clear bounce-back candidate in my opinion, and that's Ben Roethlisberger. Big Ben has traditionally performed throughout his career far better at home than on the road. And this matchup against the Seahawks is pretty juicy. We just watched Andy Dalton throw for a career-high 418 yards against them last week. That game saw a neutral game script too, meaning the Bengals game planned around trying to beat the Seattle pass defense, and they did a pretty good job at doing so, all things considered. I'd expect the Steelers to do the same, and for Ben Roethlisberger to put together a strong performance. The biggest disappointment at quarterback in Week 1 was probably Jameis Winston. He was horrible. He was terrible. And I'm worried about him on Thursday night against the Panthers. It's not because I think the Panthers have a fantastic secondary. It's because, well, first off, I don't typically like playing road quarterbacks on Thursday night. But I'm very worried about what that Panthers defensive line can do against that Tampa Bay offensive line. I'm worried about Jameis Winston under pressure. In Week 1, only Ben Roethlisberger was hurried more than Jameis Winston. But Roethlisberger was also blitzed 13 times when Winston was blitzed just 4 times, which was one of the fewer marks in the league. After that Week 1 performance, I just don't know how you can trust Jameis Winston right now, especially with pretty good waiver wire options this week like Derek Carr and Josh Allen. And as much as I love Kyler Murray and this Arizona Cardinals offense, I'd be avoiding them as much as I could this week. Arizona is the second biggest underdog on the slate, and they'll be in Baltimore to face a really good Ravens secondary, arguably the best secondary in football. And as a result, Arizona's implied team total is only better than Miami's this week. Again, with other options likely on your waiver wire, there's no need to force it. You don't need to start Kyler Murray. At running back this week, I think LeSean McCoy is a flex play, if not a low-end RB2. McCoy played less than half the number of snaps as Damian Williams played in Week 1, but he's also not been on the team very long, and he also looked pretty damn good. In the end, McCoy had a rushing success rate, which is the percentage of positive expected points runs made by a running back according to NumberFire's expected points model, but he had a success rate of 70%. Damian Williams was at about a 46%. I think we should expect the workload to favor McCoy more and more in the coming weeks. And with a potential positive game script against Oakland, he's an interesting play. But do know that for him to hit a real ceiling, he's going to have to see more work in the red zone. Damian Williams dominated there against the Jags with 4 carries and 2 carries within the 10. If you want a deeper play than McCoy, you could look at Carlos Hyde. And I can't believe that I'm saying that, but I'm saying that. Now, I do think that people seem to be overstating the impact that Hyde may be having on Duke Johnson. In week 1 against the Saints, Hyde played 17 fewer snaps and only saw 1 target. He was effective on the ground when they gave him the ball, but I'm not all that interested in players who don't have a significant receiving role. Now, with that being said, this is somewhat of a deeper play, so we can excuse flaws in a player's profile. Houston is at home, and they're facing Jacksonville and Gardner Minshew. So we could see a positive game script, which would mean a good bit of rushing. And that's where Carlos Hyde, who's more of the bruiser in that backfield, comes into play. The big question mark with Hyde is whether or not he's going to see goal line touches. We didn't get a sense of what that split might look like in week 1 because the Texans didn't run the ball at the goal line, though Duke Johnson did see a target within the 10. But if you're hurting or if you're just in a deep league, I think going Hyde's way isn't the worst idea in the world. I also think Chris Thompson is a little bit interesting this week against Dallas. In a PPR format, I would definitely be playing Thompson over Adrian Peterson. But Peterson's ranked ahead of him on Fantasy Pros right now. So I'd go Thompson over AP because of the probable game flow of this game and the fact that Thompson saw over 23% of Washington's targets in week 1. And that wasn't even in a game that saw them trail on a ton of plays. They ran 26 plays while trailing against Philadelphia. That was a below average number across the league in week 1. So without Darius Geis, Thompson's going to have some role in this offense as a pass catcher. And I like his floor-ceiling combo a lot more than Adrian Peterson's as a result. Now remember, this show is more about process than anything else. You may not have these players, but you can at least hear some of the things that I care about when I'm looking at whether I should start or sit a certain guy. But let's move on to the players that I don't like as much as the consensus this week, and let's start with the Denver backfield. That ugly, ugly Denver backfield. Royce Freeman is basically Carlos Hyde in that backfield with Phillip Lindsay as the Duke Johnson. But it's even uglier because there's more of a split in snap share. And things are a lot worse there because Denver's offense is worse than Houston's. And considering they're playing against Chicago this week, it's just tough to get behind those backs. The Bears, in a pretty neutral game script last week, allowed the 6th fewest rushing yards in the league. And that came with the 2nd best yards per attempt against. The matchup is just tough for Phillip Lindsay and Royce Freeman this week. They should find your bench. I was a little surprised to see Kenyon Drake ranked as an RB3 in PPR formats this week because this Miami offense and team really, it's just not very good. I understand that Drake is the primary pass catching back there, and he was the backfield snap leader in week 1, but he still walked away from that game with a sub 10% target share. There's nothing wrong with a 9% share through the air as a running back, but someone in Drake's position is going to need to be force-fed in order to be fantasy relevant. And against a New England defense that looked really good against Pittsburgh, I think that Drake can find your bench. It also looks like I'm a lot lower than Justin Jackson than most. Detroit's defensive line is good, and Jackson played just a quarter of the Chargers' snaps in week 1. That backfield was dominated by Austin Eckler. Eckler had over 21% of the team's targets, and he accounted for 60% of the running back rushes. Justin Jackson had just a 30% running back rushing share. So with the Eckler usage and the matchup, you can leave Jackson on your bench in week 2. Let's talk about Tyler Lockett. He had 2 targets on Sunday, but in typical Tyler Lockett form, he caught 1 for a touchdown. The Seahawks only threw the ball 20 times, but that's still not a good target share. But I expect things to pick up for him in week 2. Because in week 1, over 65% of Tyler Lockett's snaps were from the slot. The Steelers, his opponent in week 2, were arguably the worst team in football against slot receivers last year, at least from a raw production standpoint. And against New England last week, Pittsburgh allowed 3 touchdowns from receivers lined up in the slot. And about 46% of New England's targets went to slot receivers in week 1. That was the 2nd highest rate in the league. For Tyler Lockett to go nuts this week then, the Seahawks are going to have to throw the ball more than they did in week 1. And with them on the road against Pittsburgh, that's very possible. So I like Tyler Lockett a lot this week. The other 3 wide receivers that I want to talk about today that I'm higher on versus the consensus, they're all rookies. The first one is Terry McLaurin. At the time of this recording, McLaurin is currently being ranked as wide receiver 50 on Fantasy Pros. Now, I wasn't a McLaurin fan when he was entering the league, but I've got new information now. He looked good, really good, and I'm adjusting my stance. And I don't think that I'm over-adjusting the stance. I really think that he should be in wide receiver 3 territory almost weekly at this point because of the volume that he could see in that Washington offense. In week 1, McLaurin saw over 16% of Washington's targets, and he had an average depth of target that was twice as large as anyone else's on the team. Based on that alone, he's a wide receiver 3 or flex play in PPR formats moving forward. Because Washington's likely to throw the ball a good bit this year because they're going to see a lot of negative game scripts. So Terry McLaurin can absolutely find your lineup. I at least like him better than wide receiver 50. I also think that you can start Marquise Hollywood Brown. Of course his snap share is concerning. He was only on the field for like a dozen snaps in week 1. But that number should only rise as the season moves forward. And we know that Brown is a deep ball threat. We saw that in week 1. And Arizona in week 1 got torched by the deep ball. Matthew Stafford threw it 15 or more air yards on over 28% of his pass attempts against them, which was the 3rd highest rate in the league. And Arizona allowed 5 catches on those types of throws, tied for the 3rd most in the NFL. So don't be surprised if Hollywood Brown can do work again this week against this bad Cardinals secondary. Now the final rookie is Mecole Hardman. I was surprised that he wasn't as highly sought after as some of the other waiver ads this week, but the peripherals are absolutely there for him. He only saw 1 target in week 1 against Jacksonville, but he played as the team's 2nd receiver. He's the 2nd wide receiver on a Patrick Mahomes-led team. He ran the 2nd most routes behind Sammy Watkins, and he played the 2nd most snaps. So yes, I'm going to invest in the number 2 wide receivers in a Kansas City Chiefs offense with Patrick Mahomes and Andy Reid. And it's a player who basically profiles as a discount Tyreek Hill. And his production could start this week against a very beatable Oakland secondary. 2 wide receivers who are typically good plays, but I'm down on this week are Emmanuel Sanders and my man Babytron, Kenny Golladay. With Sanders, it's the Chicago defense. I'm not going to want to play guys against Chicago, let alone if that player isn't playing that much in the slot. And in week 1, that was Deshaun Hamilton's role, and that's going to be his role throughout the season. Chicago has 2 great perimeter corners, and I want nothing to do with Emmanuel Sanders and Cortland Sutton for that matter as a result. And then with Kenny Golladay, he's likely to be shadowed by Casey Hayward. Now, that was part of the reason that I didn't like T.Y. Hilton last week, but Hayward still only allowed 3 catches for 34 yards on Sunday. So I don't love Babytron in this matchup. Again, at tight end, I'm just looking at guys who may be on your waiver wire who you could play. If a tight end's getting volume, he's viable, so we'll always dig a little bit deeper on this show. Sort of. Because the first recommendation to start this week is Darren Waller, only because he needs to be rostered in 100% of leagues. He had a target share north of 30% in week 1, and he played every single snap. If that continues, he's going to be a tight end 1 in fantasy football this year. And he gets a good matchup this week against Kansas City, as I talked about earlier. Now, the dart throw at tight end is Ryan Griffin. According to PFF, of all tight ends who played last week, Ryan Griffin ran the most routes. Ryan Griffin, for those of you who don't know, plays for the Jets. And in a game this week against a Cleveland team that could push the Jets' offensive pace, and one that also just gave up a big game to tight end Delaney Walker, Griffin is a really interesting cross-your-fingers type of play. The Panthers' defense wasn't rostered in a ton of leagues entering this week because they faced the Rams in week 1. But they're in a great spot against Jameis Winston and the Bucs here in week 2. I already mentioned that the defensive line could manhandle the Bucs offensive line this week, but Jameis Winston also has averaged 1.4 interceptions per game started since the beginning of last year. That's kind of hard to comprehend. So the Panthers are a must play. Now, if you want a deeper play, you could go with Cincinnati's defense. Jimmy Garoppolo looked pretty bad in week 1. The Bengals are at home. They're favorites, and all things considered, they weren't bad against the Seahawks last week in Seattle. And they were able to generate 4 sacks. So I don't mind Cincinnati if you're scrambling to find a defense this week. That's going to do it for today's show. Thanks to all of you guys for listening. As always, if you've yet to subscribe to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. You can also follow me on Twitter at LateRoundQB. I'll do my best to answer any fantasy questions that you throw my way. Thanks, everyone. I'll talk to you tomorrow with the weekly Mailbag Show.